Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be looking at knives and bladed tools. There's so much to explore. So first, we're going to look at what are knives and bladed tools used for. We're also going to look at a lot of the most common types that you could be using for crafting. And then lastly, we'll take a look at some tips to keep in mind when buying and choosing bladed tools for your leather work. So with that, let's dive right in. Knives and bladed tools are used primarily to make large pieces of leather into smaller pieces of leather. And in general, when we're working on a project, we're going to be, taking, a large piece of leather and then cutting out a pattern or cutting out whatever design that we're making. And so to do that, we're going to be using these sharp tools to make those cuts in the material and essentially make larger pieces smaller and in the right shapes that we need. Additionally, bladed tools could also be used for art. And in leather, we've got tools that could be used for carving. And so with the two, we have both function in terms of making leather into smaller pieces, and we have aesthetics in terms of creating, artistic and unique pieces using the blade as a design tool. So that's the general need of knives, right? Seems pretty obvious. So let's dive into the different types of knives so you have an idea of what's out there and then which one or multiple you may want to use in your crafting. The most basic type of knife is the hobby knife. And we're probably all pretty familiar with this. If not, it is a small, usually metal cylinder. And on the end, we have an interchangeable blade. So you just unscrew this here, loosen that up, and you can pull the blade out and replace it with a new sharp one. And so these types of knives generally do not require sharpening. You just replace the blade. They're usually inexpensive to buy, these metal blade holders, and they work relatively well. They come in different sizes and are a great way to start if this is one of your first tools, or if you enjoy, the replaceability of those blades and just like the form factor of it. We also have the box cutter. This is another relatively economical and also very functional knife that could be used for leather cutting. Because for leather, essentially you just need a very, sharp, precise blade. And that could be, almost any type, and it'll work well. With the hobby knife, you have multiple blades within here. And you could snap these off and that'll reveal another sharpened blade. So again, no sharpening in these. They're relatively, available, inexpensive, and definitely effective for, leather working. There's the round head knife, and it's also referred to as a head knife. And it's one of the most versatile knives for leather working. Usually has about a large, half circle blade that is sharp on the rounded portion. And this way it has a large blade surface. And so you could effectively cut through thicker leathers than with smaller knives because you have a larger cutting surface on this knife. They also work really well for thin leathers and detailed cutting because there's maneuverability of that blade. And so it makes it really easy for cutting straight lines as well as for cutting curves. And the blade depth can be controlled manually through, how much pressure one is putting while using it. So there's definitely some advantages to that as well. And they come in a lot of different brands and qualities. And the biggest thing to keep in mind about that is that it has a comfortable feel in your hand. Because it's a very manual tool, you're going to want to make sure that, it connects with you and your working style and it feels good and you have control while using it. And the swivel knife. So the swivel knife is a very popular tool. It's used very often in leather tooling and carving and making intricate patterns, in leather designs. And so, for example, this is a very rough, very rough design, but I use the knife to kind of, cut those lines in there and do some things. This is by no means a finished piece, more just a very quick, draft with a knife. And these knives have essentially a swivel on top. And so what you can do is they're meant to be held in your hand, and this could move and swivel while you're working with it. So you've got a lot of different control options with it. Often these knives have interchangeable blades, so you could switch out the type. Some are going to be steel, some are going to be ceramic, and other materials as well. There's also some adjustability here where you can open this up and increase the distance so it can fit into your particular hand and have just the right length for what you're working on and be very comfortable. So they're pretty neat. They come in all kinds of materials, steel, brass, and so it really depends on what you're looking for. There's even some other different mechanisms for these tools in terms of how the blades go in and out and are changed. So a lot of variability, but in essence, this is the swivel knife tool. And the blade styles can change as well. You can have straight blades like this. There are also angled blades and different, approaches to using them. So definitely, if you're looking to get into carving or tooling, this is going to be something you'll want to use. And the learning curve is relatively quick. After you do a few projects with it, you start to actually get comfortable. It looks intimidating. It's really not. So that is the swivel knife. The flat knife is a style with a long, thin metal blade that extends through a long, flat handle. And sometimes the handle itself is going to be the same material as the blade, essentially one piece of metal, and just the end is going to be sharpened, as the blade end. And so it's almost like a hobby knife in that, it's just the one piece of metal, as the blade as well. With these, the edge could be resharpened for a very long time. Since that material is essentially, runs through the knife, not all of it's going to be, edge worthy, though they're relatively strong and durable. And so you could have one easily, for years, sometimes decades, with proper care and maintenance. And the flatness of the handle helps give it good control. And these are often used, in shoemaking, bookbinding, things like that, where you want to have, a larger blade, but also, control within the hand, for very, precise and consistent cuts. The bevel point knife has a beveled edge to the blade. So this helps for skiving and edge trimming, where you want to get a little more control over how deep the cut is, and also in what path that blade moves through the cut. And so for example, if you want to make, a pretty deep cut edge and taper it as you move forward, and leaving a little bit of an edge on that when you're doing finishing work, the beveled shape of the blade, can help with that because it gives you a little more control over how that edge shaves away, given the shape of the blade. So it's really good for precise edge work. It could certainly work well for, straight cuts and any kind of curved cuts you're looking to do. The curved lip knife. This is a cool one. It looks pretty interesting. Not as common as other knives, yet they're usually made of steel and used most often by cobblers. They can be designed for right or left-handed use, and they have a uniquely shaped bent tip, and it's got a sharp edge that allows for the even trimming of shoe soles. And that's why it looks really sturdy too, because it has to cut through that thicker leather, but also be able to have some maneuverability to match those curves of those cuts as well. So especially with this kind of tool, you want to find one that has a comfortable handle and fits well in the hand, and that way you'll have good control over it when using it. Trimming knives are used for finer, detailed work. They're available with both straight and curved blades, and if you notice, it's a relatively smaller blade than other knives. And so they're going to be really good for cutting out intricate patterns, trimming thread, working on small details, including like on edges and seams and trim work. It's kind of like the detail tool of the knife world for leatherworking. The sharp point knife, it's a little bit of a longer knife, maybe around 6 to 8 inches, often with a steel blade and a curved end. And this gives the blade more cutting surface. If we think back to our round knife, that's even more cutting surface. So this is a similar concept on a smaller knife where there's more control over curved cuts. And so this is a great one that cobblers and shoemakers use because they want that maneuverability, around the curves of the shoes. This also works well for cutting through thicker leather, as a larger blade surface makes that a lot easier because you've got essentially a bigger tool and more leverage, so it can more easily handle that thicker leather. The curved blade trim knife is a specialized type of knife, and it allows for more agility in cuts. And so if you're doing, mid to small sized curved cuts and want something that has a sharp edge and is more nimble in its movements, and can make those cuts, more free form, then this is something that can work for that. Usually, again, for intricate patterns, you could use it for trimming threads, things at that scale that you want a reliable, smaller knife for. The straight knife, this one you've probably seen. It's pretty popular. It's got a long straight blade it may have a taper on the edge in the front. And these are going to be good for straight cuts. They're going to be good for skiving knives. They're going to be good even for some curve cuts if you want to use the edge of that blade. But they're essentially super popular, something that you'll likely get good use from. And there are a lot of different handle styles available. So a key thing will be to find one that works with your crafting style, and this one feels good, and that way you've got good control over that tool while using it. The Rand knife and the Welt knife, essentially another cobbler's tool. There's some specialty knives that cobblers will use. Some will be ones that saddle makers use. This is another one of those shoemakers use. It comes in right and left-handed versions, and it has a uniquely angled blade that makes it useful for trimming the leather, the soles of shoes. Again, it's just a specialized tool. If you want to get into that type of work, this is something that you may come across. And for its job, because it's specially designed, it does a great job on that precise type of work. The channel knife, another shoemaker's knife. This one is used for primarily cutting a channel into the insole of the shoe leather. And so those channels could be used for stitch lines and things like that, especially in the thicker working widths of shoe leather and the different layers that have to come together at those seam lines. So this blade has a curve to it that helps it rest just right into that leather and then get a nice deep cut. So it makes that work a lot easier. The paring knife, this is another kind of smaller specialty knife found very often in the bookbinding industry. They come in a variety of sizes and blade types, including rounded, angled, and straight. French paring knives generally have a semi-rounded blade with an upright handle. Swiss paring knives, for example, have a rounded blade, though don't have the handle. It's just more an extension of the metal from the blade, and you hold on to that, so it's like a singular bladed tool. English paring knives, we're getting multinational now. They usually have a very large, leather cutting flat knives, where the end has an angled blade, and the metal from the blade continues up and is essentially the handle itself, similar to the French paring knives. The English paring knives are available often in right and left-handed versions, and that makes it obviously more comfortable to use based on if you're right or left-handed, and also more effective because the angle of the blade could be different, based on which way you're cutting from. German paring knives are a mix of these other styles, so they usually feature a long blade with a curved end, offering the versatility and agility of a curved blade, but also have that straight portion that extends up onto the handle. The handle is usually a nicely finished wood. So again, a little bit different there. You get some blade variation, and also you have the handle on there. So if you prefer, like a wooden handle over just a steel, the blade handle, that could be an option as well. And one of my favorites is the Rotary Cutter. So these are essentially a rounded bladed tool. They've got circular blades that can be continuously pushed or pulled to make cuts in materials. And since the blades rotate, they can cut really long distances without having to pick up and reset the blade. So that can make it very effective if you're trying to cut big pieces and you want a straight cut. These are amazing. And for example, let's do a quick cut so you can see. So they're cool. They usually have these locking mechanisms. So the blade is in there and it's not extended. So it's not going to cut anything. But then when you extend it down, now the blade's available to cut. And so if we come here, you just kind of lay it over, and then you can just cut right through here, like that, over that. So they're great. This will snap back in, go back into safety. And there's different manufacturers. The blades are usually relatively sharp, and you can find one that has the right handle that fits your hand, and they're excellent options. I recommend them. An accessory to bladed tools are cut-resistant gloves. So these are essentially just gloves that have material properties that make them resistant to blade penetration and kind of cutting. So depending on what you're working on, if you're doing, a lot of long frequent cuts or something, or even if you just want to protect your hand, if you have a bladed glove like this, if the knife blade were to go over it, it is less likely to cut through the material because it's designed to protect against cuts like that. So that could be something useful depending on what you're doing, and you might as well keep those fingers looking good and working. Similar to that, here's a safety cutting ruler, and essentially what this does is it has a part that flips up, and then the finger can go behind this when you're cutting. And so if you've got a knife, for example, this rotary cutter, your finger is now behind this blade, this protected part. So if the knife were to skip a little bit, it's going to hit this shield and not go into your finger. So that could be something useful that you could enjoy. And again, keeping those fingers safe because they're one of the most important parts to crafting. Strap cutters are handheld, often wooden devices that are used to cut a long piece of leather into a consistent width. So for example, a strap to be used on a bag or even for cutting for belts or things like that. Because if we look at, here's an example of a belt. So we've got very consistent width throughout the belt, right? It would be super weird to have a belt where it's kind of wavy unless you're doing that as a specific design choice. You want it consistent. And so to do that, the strap cutter, we have a blade inside here. Let's see that. And then we have this measurable mechanism here that we can adjust to our width. So say we want a certain width, we unscrew this. This moves in and out. We set the width based on the markings that are here. And then once we get the width that we want, we could tighten it down and secure it in place, and then this no longer moves. With that, if we had a big piece of leather, say for example, just for context, something like this, we could put that in, and it meets up flush against this part here, and we basically draw it through, and that blade that's inside is going to cut this leather, into whatever consistent width that was. And then we'll get a strap out of that that's consistent throughout. So that makes it really easy to make those long straight cuts that would otherwise be very difficult if you were doing it with a ruler or even by freehand, things like that. And so some of these come in metal variations, and some are also called plows. So typically with this strap cutter we pull backwards, there are going to be some where you lay the material down and then you actually push forwards through the material. It still works with the same concept of having an area here and a fixed distance, and so that way it's going to always use this edge as its guide, although it's just a pushing motion, instead of a pulling motion. If you're looking to do larger volume work or you want a lot of basically consistent strap pieces, there are strap cutting machines. And these are great because they're essentially electrically powered machines where you could do high volume repetitive strap cutting very easily. Mostly are powered by electricity. Some are also hand crank, so if you're looking to do that. Some are also hand pull. So you have a strap cutter where it's mounted, instead of like this where it's feeding through the machine, it's essentially manual where you line up the leather and then pull it through the machine yourself. And so depending on if you're getting into that type of work, they would be a great addition and help make things much more efficient. Leather shears. So these are going to be generally, less than 6 inches in length, and they have a nice cutting surface where you can kind of cut through the leather material flat on a table. And so for some applications where you have thinner leathers that are almost like fabrics, where you have some fabrics that you're working with your leathers, shears can be good. You could definitely mark that material and then kind of cut through it, just like you would with scissors. Some are going to have angled pieces here so you can rest flat on the table as you push. And some are going to be like this that are more traditional, where you can just kind of cut through it with the material raised as you're cutting. And they vary in materials as well, though overall they're going to be made of steel with a relatively sharp blades. And for these, maintenance is key. because having a sharp blade, especially in scissors, is going to make the difference between mediocre results and a really nice fine cut. Thread scissors. These are the little guys. So they're going to be great if you're doing hand sewing and you need to, cut threads. Also, if you're working in a sewing machine and you're cutting, bobbin threads or things related to that, they generally have small finger holes and then this little extension here for more support. So when you're grabbing them, you can control them relatively precisely. Whereas if you had 2 holes, you got some play. Here, you can have a nice grip and then precisely cut those tiny little threads and not nick up your material. The lacing cutter. So this essentially, it has a razor blade aligned horizontally in the middle. So you have a long piece of leather and then it kind of lines up and it's pulled through. And then what you're going to end up with is a bunch of leather lace. Essentially, it's going to be, the width of the cutter right here. And that way, if you don't have a dedicated mechanized lacing machine, you could do a hand version as well. And you could end up turning bigger pieces of leather essentially into your own lace. And lacing can be used literally as like lacing for shoes. It could also be used to join leather together. A lot of different applications. So cutting dies are a really helpful addition, to certain projects. When you find that, you're making a lot of something, like say you've designed a wallet or a watch strap, once you have that design figured out, it can take a lot of time to like manually cut that same design out over and over. So leather cutting dies solve that by essentially being preformed metal shapes with sharpened edges. And when pressure is applied to the top, they essentially, strike out material in that exact shape. So instead of cutting, line by line that you do, just one stamp and that leather shape is cut. It's amazing. It could take what takes 5, 10, 20 minutes depending on the complexity of the cut and turning it down into like seconds. So really efficient. You'll find you'll use this more as you're doing more production volume work. So moving beyond one-off pieces. And again, if you're doing like selling a, wallets, accessories, things like that, this will be really, really helpful. They can come often custom made, so you can get them whatever shape your design is. There's often pre-made shapes as well for common designs and cuts and sizes. So they're big, and depending on what you're doing, you'll probably come across them, at some point. The clicker press. All right. So these are going to be tools that apply a large amount of force to a very small area to help cut out a design. So in them, we typically are going to use our dies, and dies are pre-shaped items that we're looking to cut out of leather. And maybe it's a design that you've made, or maybe it's something that you purchased and you want, and it's a common design or a shape. And essentially, using the clicker press, it will apply that force to that die and then cut the leather, almost instantly. So they fit on a tabletop. You could also have much larger ones that are freestanding on the floor. They have different strengths behind them. Some are going to be manually operated, where you kind of pull the handle down and that force through leverage, cuts through the material. Others are going to be mechanically powered, where you can just kind of, pull them down and it'll click out, the shape and the cut. So these are hugely popular. If you're getting into higher volume production work, you'll probably find these, they are great. So with so many different bladed tools, what to keep in mind, right? I can't get all these, there'd be 20, 30 of them. The biggest things to keep in mind are start where you are. If you're making a certain type of good, or you want to try making a certain type of leather good, look at the knife for that style first. Within that, I definitely recommend buying a quality one, because knives could last a really long time when well cared for. If you buy cheaper knives, the results are going to be poor. You're not really going to be happy with them, and it's not going to be an optimal experience. So find the type of knife that you'd like, and then try to find a medium of the road quality. Doesn't have to be amazing, but usually the cheapest ones are not the best. So look for that. Maintain them well. A sharp blade is going to make the difference between an okay project and an easy one. It can often be a little more safe as well, because sharper blades generally have more predictable cutting paths, Usually when blades get a little duller, they may jump the leather, things like that. So a sharp blade, if used with care, is going to be a great thing to consider. And along with that, you don't need 100 different ones. You'll find through experience which ones you like the best. If you are trying to test out a few, you can look on reseller sites and then buying them used. And if they're in good condition used, you can often save a lot that way. So with that, I recommend follow what you enjoy. Find the right tools that will support that, especially these knives and cutting ones. The biggest ones I would recommend are going to be a very simple hobby knife or any kind of a straight knife and a rotary cutter. They're going to do most of the jobs. If you're going up from there, you want to do some art and tooling and carving, then you're going to want your swivel knife. And if you're making any kind of straps and you don't want to buy them pre-cut, this could be a strap cutter. Could be a really easy way to kind of get into that relatively inexpensively. So those are some tips and thoughts on knives and bladed tools. There you have it. So if you have any questions, let us know. If you have any favorites or recommendations or additions to suggest, also let us know. And until next time, keep crafting.